boarding in international schools here at Baker and Bloom. My name is Steve Leech. We'll do a little bit of an introduction here in a few minutes. We'll be looking through a number of the admissions tests that students in Hong Kong might be looking at taking for admissions to international schools in the city and boarding schools in various places around the globe. We'll be looking at the different tests that are out there on the market, some of the structure. There's a lot of very similar structures, and also some skills that students will be challenged on, and some steps we can take now to start preparing students for success later on. We'll be having a Q&A at the end of the presentation, so if you've got any questions, please just write them down and hold them, and we'll get to those towards the end. So this is me. As you can see, I'm a secondary English teacher and test prep specialist here at Baker and Bloom. My background is I'm a British national, but most of my higher education is in the United States. I've been teaching test prep since 2007. And I've been based in Hong Kong now for 7 years, just over 7 years. I specialize in secondary English education, IB, AP, that sort of thing, and standardized admissions tests for students looking to enter secondary schools, students looking to enter university, and sometimes I even get some graduate admissions as well. So first things first, we're going to be looking at two basic groups of tests. There is the SSAT and the ISEE, which are two very similar tests. They are almost always taught together because they are testing a lot of the same fundamental skills, a lot of the same material gets covered as well. If you look at a lot of the sort of the Princeton Review and Kaplan books, they will be joint test books. Like the Princeton Review has an SSAT ISEE book. They don't do them separately. This is mostly going to be for North American schools in the US and Canada, and a variety of the Hong Kong international schools also require one or the other. Towards the end, we're going to be talking a little bit about individual school exams, which is a bit more focused on the British model, which tends to be much more individually oriented to specific schools. A lot of the schools have their own exams based on a general format that are often referred to as the 11 plus, 13 plus school exams, though the 11 and 13 referring to the student age rather than grade. So even though the two tests are the two groups of tests are quite different in format, they are testing a lot of the same fundamental skills and in many ways a lot of the same fundamental knowledge. So very basics. This is stuff that's going to apply to all of the tests across the board. And these are 4 general strategies that are going to be useful really up into even those graduate school admissions tests I mentioned earlier. So one of them is the process of elimination. A lot of students go into the test looking for the right answer. And there isn't always a right answer, because very often students go and they think, okay, I want a 5-star answer. I want the answer that is the ideal I have in my mind, and that ideal is not one of the answer choices on the test. And so process of elimination helps students recognize, okay, I'm going to look for the worst answer and work my way up to the best, so that they don't go in, get frustrated that they can't find a 5-star answer, and instead can eliminate their way up and recognize, oh, this 3-star answer is for. They also want to bear in mind strategic guessing. Depending on which test the student is taking, guessing may or may not be helpful. The SSAT, for example, penalizes students 1/4 of a point for every wrong answer. But if a question is left blank, there's no penalty. So guessing can be a problem on the SSAT. So a fundamental strategy, regardless of the test, is to understand the scoring systems and to guess strategically based on the penalties and points available. The third one here is going step by step or chewing your food. A lot of students try to do all of the problems all in one big step, doing a lot of the calculations and a lot of the different steps all at once in their head. I get a lot of students who definitely try to show off doing this. And there are no style points on the test. No one really cares if you do it all in one step. Going more slowly prevents a lot of mistakes, and it also allows students to conserve mental energy to raise their overall level of performance. A lot of the strategies I teach are based on slowly and analytically going through the question and taking apart piece by piece to turn a big, intimidating problem into a 3 or 4 step series of much easier problems. And then finally, we want to know our enemy. We want to understand the test. We want to know what's coming on the test. As we'll see later on in the presentation, there are some question types that are built around students not being familiar with them. A lot of the tests are designed for students to encounter them once and kind of be intimidated or shocked by them. But if we can get students familiar with test structure, with the tricks and quirks of each individual test as best we can, with some of the individual school tests, it can be challenging. We can better prepare them for success by helping them have a less stressful experience. Okay, so this is just a quick overview of the SSAT and ISEE. I do have a more detailed breakdown table, which we'll be making available later on. I'll just have to confer with Phil about how we're doing that. Both tests handle these 4 sections: reading comprehension, verbal reasoning, quantitative reasoning, and essay questions. Depending on which version of the test your student is taking, because these tests are broken down also by age range. They have 3 levels that are for younger students, middle-aged students, and older students. The details are a little bit different for each one, but it's essentially for elementary or primary school, middle school or junior high school, and then high school, secondary school. The reading comprehension on both tests is exceedingly similar. There's not a large functional difference between the two. Students will be given passages of a variety of types and have to answer questions based on those passages. The 2 big challenges there are going to be comprehension skills and time. We'll be getting into more detail on each of these sections shortly. Verbal reasoning is probably the single most challenging section on any test I teach, mostly due to the format and structure of the test. Both the SSAT and the ISEE have synonym sections, and we'll see an example of a synonym question soon, but essentially the students are given a word and must choose the closest synonym from a list of 5 on the SSAT or 4 on the ISEE. It's very challenging because students aren't being tested on skills or ability. In many ways, it's simply, have you seen this word? Do you know this word? And then, have you seen these answer choices? Do you know these answer choices? The SSAT also has analogies, where students have to fill out comparisons. Glove is to hand as boot is to, and then they'll have a variety of choices. And obviously foot would be the correct answer. On the ISEE, it's sentence completion, where they are given a sentence with a blank and have to fill in the blank or 2 blanks with the appropriate word. Those are easier to train for because there's more structure to the question, and we can look at things like common relationships, we can look for trap answers, and we can use critical thinking skills to take apart the question itself in order to find a correct solution. Quantitative reasoning is a fancy way of saying math. It's the mathematics section. Depending on the age range, it's going to cover different material. The SSAT and ISEE are very similar overall in the subjects they test, but the formats are a bit different. The ISEE has a section that's all about finding which value is highest. There are two columns, column A and column B, and students have to determine if the value in column A is higher or the value in column B, or if they are the same, or if it cannot be determined. And then there's a variety of formulas and questions based on that. Most students in Hong Kong have a very strong grasp of the math fundamentals, but we'll look at some of the challenges when we get to the quantitative reasoning section shortly. And then both the SSAT and the ISEE have essay questions. Depending on which level your student is at, they may have only narrative choices, which is essentially writing a short story, or they may also have the option of doing a personal essay, which is much more focused on individual value, argumentation, and expression of ideas. The essays are not graded. They are not given a score. Instead, what happens is the essay is scanned and a copy of the essay is sent with the score report to the school. So the schools will get a copy of the student's handwritten essay. So let's take a look at some of these sections in more specific detail. So these are some general strategies for reading comprehension. The format of the test is very straightforward. There is a short passage, and the students have about 4 or 5 questions to answer based on the passage. One of the big challenges I see is that a lot of students don't have the reading muscles they need to necessarily read quickly and effectively. So the earlier that students can start building a lot of those reading muscles, the better off they will be. And a lot of that is reading challenging texts. Very often I get students who are reading for fun, and reading for fun is essentially lightweight reading. Very often students are reading books aimed at or below their grade level. But in order to prepare for these tests, we should really be looking at texts that are a little bit above grade level, which it's definitely a challenge getting young students to read difficult books. I've definitely had long conversations with parents about that sort of thing. And it is challenging. What I have found is that starting with smaller texts, very much associated with a student's interests, is the best way to go, and then hopefully building up, building out. We have here a link at the bottom to some resources for book suggestions sourced from a variety of staff members here at Baker and Bloom and a variety of age levels. And I'm sure if you come in and talk to some members of staff, they'll be able to make other suggestions as well. And as we've said, on the reading section, eliminating wrong answers improves your score and saves your energy. Another useful thing about the reading comprehension sections is that the questions are usually very formulaic. We can break down the questions into about 10 types, and each type handles information in a different way. So we can refine strategies and refine skills for answering each of these question types specifically. Each one would also have its same trap answers. So ideally, we can get a student to a position where he or she looks and goes, aha, D is too broad in its scope. That's a typical trap answer. And B is too narrow in its scope. That's a typical trap answer. E, that's just ridiculous. And very often students who eat a lot of the past papers, who really practice with a lot of the existing materials, start to notice these kind of patterns, which again helps them move quickly through the test, answering accurately and efficiently, saving a lot of their mental resources for other sections. Here we have some examples of verbal reasoning from the SSAT and ISEE. The First question, question number 1, meager, is an example of the synonyms questions I mentioned earlier. As you can see, if you don't know the word meager, this is going to be a very challenging question. Similarly, if there are any vocab words in here that you're not familiar with, that's going to be an obstacle to overcome. Question 2 is an example of the analogies questions. These are questions found on the SSAT. Again, a big obstacle is going to be vocabulary. Frequently, I find students who would absolutely understand the relationships being asked about if they understood the vocabulary. One thing I found that is frustrating with the SSAT is that they will use specialized vocabulary such as the technical names of young animals. So students may have to know that, for example, a young whale is a calf. Or another one that we see sometimes is that the SSAT will use units of measurement. So students may have to understand which is bigger, a pint or a quart. This isn't necessarily something that students should really drill very hard, because there's a question of how much time am I putting in for getting points out. But it is something to be aware of that does come up. Question 3 is the sentence completion from the ISEE. And as we can see, it's a fairly straightforward, fairly common sentence completion that probably you're all remembering from your time at school. Very common question type. And here, there's obviously a lot more material to work with in the question itself, and there's more we can do. Unfortunately, the verbal reasoning section is particularly difficult, so let's look at some things that we can do now to help build student vocabulary. One of the first things we can do, and something that I find is very, very important in helping with students recalling word meanings under pressure, is building many language connections. When I talk to my students, very often they tell me that they are studying vocabulary by sitting and memorizing definitions. They will have a list of vocab words, they will look up the definitions, and then they will memorize one-to-one. So that if I say to them, oh, what is the definition of the word gregarious? They can immediately shoot me back a dictionary definition. But if I come at them from a different angle and I say, can you give me a synonym for sociable? They can't access the word gregarious, which means sociable, because in their minds, they have a one-to-one connection between the word and the definition. And what we want to do is we want to build many more connections. We want to be looking at synonyms. We want to be looking at how the word is used in a sentence. We want the students to really know the word rather than having memorized the word, because the more connections they have, the more paths they have to access that word under test conditions. One of the things we can do is we can gamify learning vocabulary. There are a lot of apps available for building vocabulary. There are a lot of language building games. English is a language that is very easy to play with. So I have my students make flashcards with a variety of information, things like synonyms, antonyms, definitions, example sentences, and I encourage them to play games with those cards. If they have classmates who are also, or friends who are also studying vocabulary, also preparing for these tests, they can quiz each other. They can turn the cards into a game, which obviously, if they're having fun, they're going to be much more willing to learn, and the learning is going to be more effective. I know a lot of people who push for etymology, which is breaking down the words into prefixes, suffixes, taking apart the words to see how they've been formed over time. And etymology can be a powerful tool. It can be very useful, but it's also very difficult because the English language has a very long and complex history, and it gets words from a lot of different ways and a lot of different backgrounds. So it very much comes down to individual students. I've had some students who went very hard into etymology, but it didn't click with them. It wasn't the right strategy for their learning style, and so they weren't able to take it quite far enough, and it wound up hurting them because they were relying too much on an incomplete strategy. On the other hand, some students really take to it, they really enjoy it, they can really take it very far, and they're able to use it to great success. Ultimately, though, it is not a silver bullet because the language is too complicated. Relationships, though, relationships between word types, relationships between meanings, relationships between parts of speech are a great secret weapon. Understanding how words connect to each other is a really useful skill for the verbal reasoning section on the SSAT and ISEE. For vocabulary, you want to start early, but also recognize that it is a section that is going to take a lot of resources in order to get points. And there is also an element of luck. You could study 1,000 words and expand vocabulary by 1,000 words, but if those words don't show up on the test, you're not going to get those points. So it is a challenge, and the earlier you start, the more time you have to make progress. Okay, quantitative reasoning, the math section, is a section that a lot of students in Hong Kong do very well on because the city has overall a very strong mathematics education system. Generally, what I see difficulties coming from is not the material so much as how the material is presented and how the test is structured. Students are not allowed a calculator. Generally speaking, some of the individual schools may allow a calculator, but for the most part, students will not be allowed a calculator. The SSAT and ISEE explicitly forbid a calculator. And a lot of students are not practicing properly working with a pencil and paper. So working with mental arithmetic and calculating with a pencil and paper is a big step forward in speeding up, easing students' anxieties, making them more comfortable, building confidence, and also preserving mental energy. And it also helps reduce those simple mistakes that everyone has in maths. It's also important to learn to recognize what I call gimmick questions. We'll take a look at a gimmick question on the next slide or possibly the slide after. Gimmick questions are questions that are technically math, but it's this sort of thing where there's a trick to the question and it's designed to intimidate students who are seeing it once. If we see them beforehand, however, and we get used to that, they're really very easy. I compare them to magic tricks. It's really, really impressive when you first see them. It can be intimidating and it has a great impact. But once you see how it's done, it's really no big deal. Another challenge is to understand what the question is asking. The tests structure questions in ways such as word problems, such as using data tables for students to find numbers. And some students get confused by the presentation of the question. They can do the math once they understand what the question is asking, but the challenge is understanding what the question is asking. So a key skill is understanding how to break down a question, analyze it piece by piece, and recognize what information is useful. And then finally, the step I tell all of my students to do, and a great many of them still don't, is writing down every step. Writing down every step helps save mental energy, helps reduce simple mistakes, and also provides a resource for if you have made a simple mistake, you can go back and quickly see where you've made it. I get so many students who want to do all of the math in their head, and they make simple calculation errors, or they get overwhelmed. And there are no style points. You don't get extra credit for doing it all in your head. So students really need to practice writing down every step. So here we have one example of a gimmick question, which is often referred to as a symbolism question. So here in the box on the side of the screen, we have for all real numbers f, and then we have f with a box equals negative 2f. So the test essentially just makes up an arbitrary system and then challenges students to use math they're familiar with in that system. So very often with this type of question, A student will look at it and be intimidated because he or she has never seen the square before. But realistically, you don't have to. You're not supposed to. The test has made this up. This is simply, do you understand how variables work? And most students, I should say, this question came from an upper level SSAT. Obviously, if your student is doing the elementary level SSAT, he or she will not be doing variable mathematics. But for a lot of students, this is a great challenge if they don't recognize the trick. They're being intimidated by the format rather than the actual problem. And this is just one example. There are several others that come up over and over and over. One that the SSAT likes to do is giving a series of shapes and asking which one can be drawn without taking your pencil off the page. And there are a variety of others, and they all usually have their own tricks. So this is, again, a place where building familiarity with the test itself, practicing with past papers, is going to be a great way to get ahead. Okay, and the writing questions. The writing questions are the essays. Most of the students taking these tests are going to be going with the narrative. At the lower age levels on both tests, students take a narrative. They only have narrative choices, which means that they are being asked to write a story in 25 or 30 minutes. This is difficult for a lot of students because they're not used to being creative under pressure. And even for grown adults, it can be difficult to be creative under pressure. So what you want to do is do more of the creativity beforehand while you have time. Very rarely do the prompts require a specific type of response or a specific type of story. Usually, the prompt doesn't really tell us anything about the story. It's just a place to get started. They're very often things like, she should have seen it coming, or Mike opened the box with great expectations. And so really you can spin any story you want off those prompts. So one thing to do is understand story structure. I get a lot of stories that don't really have a conflict or a climax, and they're not engaging to read. Don't get too complicated because you don't have a great deal of time. You don't have a great deal of space. You don't get extra paper. Mind your time. And if you can go in with a few almost pre-written stories or basic story formats that you can then adapt to any specific details that might come up in the prompt, that's going to be a great way to get ahead. I usually tell my students to have between 3 and 5, not exactly pre-written stories, but basic narratives that they can then adapt to the prompt. Personal questions are usually limited to the older groups for the SSAT and ISEE, but the British style and individual schools may be more reliant on them. And the personal prompts tend to be things like, describe a time when you were challenged, or if you had a company, what would your company do? And this is an opportunity for students to express their personality, their values, and their interests. It's essentially an extension of things like the interview and the any sort of written application essays that may be there. So students should consider what's important to them. How do they want to present themselves? If they are interested in science, then how can they use this to show science? One time I was challenged in my science class, and here is how I succeeded. If I had a company, we would do scientific research. If the student is interested in art, or if family is particularly important to them, or if they have a great emphasis in values such as cooperation, these are opportunities to show it. It's also a great way to tie those values, such as cooperation, teamwork, family, faith, this sort of thing, to extracurricular activities or hobbies. A common kind of idea is related to heroes and people of value. So a student might have an athlete or a scientist as a person of value, and then showing the connection. Here's how my hero relates to my values. Obviously, that kind of introspection and personal analysis is much more oriented towards older students. All right, so the British style tests basically cover a lot of the general strategies that we've already addressed. The reading comprehension is very, very similar. They may not be multiple choice, but it is essentially about reading, understanding, and repeating that information. The quantitative is, again, essentially math tests, and we want to be careful of recognizing difficulties between how to do the calculation and how to understand the question. The essays are also very similar. There's a lot of variation between individual schools. Even within the city, you might have one school whose test looks nothing like another school's, even though they are going to be testing very much the same sort of skills. If you're not sure, talk to the school. They will offer what specifics they can. Some of the schools can be quite tight-lipped because they don't want to give too much information away. Generally, the tests are going to be composed of mathematics, reading comprehension, verbal reasoning, non-verbal reasoning, and writing. Not necessarily all 5 of these. Some schools don't use the non-verbal reasoning, which we'll see shortly. Some schools don't do the writing because they're doing interviews and admission essays. Some schools just break it down to like mathematics and verbal reasoning and that sort of thing. But it's usually a selection from those 5. But as we say, it's a lot of the same fundamental skills packaged slightly differently. Now, we're just going to highlight the verbal reasoning for the British style and the non-verbal reasoning because these are fairly unique. British style verbal reasoning is a very different animal. Here we can see some British style verbal reasoning questions. This is just 2 different types. There are all kinds, but they very much are focusing on ideas of like vocabulary and puzzle solving. So this first section where we have the code breaking, this is almost a mathematical puzzle. And it's really using the verbal element as one element of a larger puzzle. In the second group, we can see it's playing with ideas of spelling, but it also relies on vocabulary. One thing I do find is that students who are coming from a background of a much more character-based language, a lot of students who are very much grounded in Chinese or similar languages, aren't always as strong playing with words in forms of letters. They're less used to breaking words apart into letters. One of the great things about these sections, though, is that there are a lot of games that you can play. There are a lot of tools available in terms of word scrambles, crosswords, anagrams, code breaker games that can help students build the skills that they need for this sort of thing. A lot of students I've taught who have done really well on these sections have come from backgrounds where the families are playing these sorts of games, games like Scrabble, Words with Friends, just for fun, which is helping them out. They're using a lot of skills similar to the non-verbal reasoning questions, which we'll take a look at now. And here we have some examples of non-verbal reasoning questions. They tend to be looking at pattern recognition and critical thinking. So in these first 2 questions, students are looking to break the code. The letters in the boxes represent particular styles or ideas, and students need to break them down and figure out which code represents the last box. So if we just look through very quickly, in question 1, I recognize that G on the bottom corresponds to the 2 circles. So I'm going to eliminate G from my answer because I am looking for a square. So that gets rid of D and E. I recognize that the square I want has both crosses, the vertical and the diagonal cross. And I see that in the first box with the circle. So I'm looking for an A. So my answer is going to be B. it can be quite challenging for students to get there. And again, one of the big things is to sort important information from the distractions. This is chewing your food or going step by step, breaking down the question piece by piece to look, if we look at the bottom ones, we can look, okay, there's a lot of elements going on here. There's differences in shape, there's differences in shading, there's differences in color, differences in orientation. Breaking those elements down and recognizing how they work together, which ones are important and which ones aren't. Again, these are very much the game type of question. And if students are working on puzzles, riddles, critical thinking exercises, looking at pattern recognition, they're going to be in a much better position to work with the nonverbal reasoning sections. So that's the overall information based there. We will be doing a Q&A shortly. I just want to bring up that registration is open for the spring 2021 session, which is now open, running through June 5th. If you want tuition dates and the course catalog, we have a QR code for you to scan here. I'll just give a minute in case people want to scan that, and then there are a few upcoming talks that may be interesting to you that we'll just highlight briefly. So coming up at the end of February, we have Unleashing the Creative Writer in Your Child, which is going to be hosted by some of our primary teachers. We have Miss Lenore Look, who is an award-winning children's author. She is the writer of the Alvin Ho book series, which is very, I don't know how many books there are in that series, but it's a very popular series. And then Miss Stefania Albanese and Miss Megan Kwan Nixon, who are another two of our primary teachers. That's coming up at the end of February. And then we have the Future of Work with Miss Renee Bowie, who is the founder of Baker and Bloom. She's a wonderful teacher, a very interesting mind. She's going to be discussing the future of work. And then we have US College Admissions Journeys, again with Miss Bowie, Miss Karen Kwok, and Dr. Min Tran, who are members of our admissions counseling team. And again, we have a QR code there if you're interested and you would like to RSVP. If you would like general information, here we have a lot of our contact information. I will leave this on the screen. And now I'd like to just open the floor to any questions people may have.
I think Jess is saying something, but we can't hear her. Jess, if you want to say something, like you can type it out and I'll read it out for you. Okay, so Jess asks, when do students need to start preparing?
Sorry, I was just starting to reply there with my microphone off.
No worries.
Students generally, I recommend, should start preparing between 12 and 18 months before they expect to be taking the test. Now, obviously, that's an ideal. Obviously, you know, sometimes with students, the decision to apply to a school that is using one of these tests comes later than that. But ideally, yeah, 12 to 18 months, that gives time for prep work, and also, if necessary, time to take the test twice, or perhaps even 3 times. Depending on sort of the school's limitations, you may be able to take the test multiple times and retest. And depending on the individual policies, it's almost always a good idea to take the test twice because scores almost always improve as students feel more confident and more comfortable with the test and in test conditions. But yeah, I would say usually between 12 and 18 months before the expected test date.
Hi, I'm Steve. Thank you very much. Just now, I'm not sure why the audio in my other computer is not working. So yes, I just tried to end. I would like to throw a few questions out there that a lot of parents ask us. And other participants, if you have any questions, please feel free to write it out in the question box. So Steve, a lot of parents ask us like if these kind of tests, especially if it's like kind of the ones that are not ISEE and SSAT, those kind of formats, how can they prepare for the writing part? Like there is usually maybe some kind of creative writing prompt or some kind of persuasive writing prompt. And this part seems to be a part that a lot of parents have questions on. So I was hoping to get your advice on this part and how can students prepare for it?
Well, that's an excellent question because it is a challenge, and I would break that down into two parts. One is generation of ideas, and the other is presentation of ideas. So with generation of ideas, one of the best things that you can do is expose students to more ideas. So for things like persuasive, I mean, a lot of the students that are taking these tests are at an age where they love to argue. So encouraging a kind of debate or having students explore their ideas in conversation is a great way to get them used to exploring these ideas and explaining their own chains of logic. What I find a lot of times is that students are worried about expressing their ideas because very often they're not associating schoolwork with the real world. And schoolwork, very often, they don't want to take risks, they don't want to take chances because it's for a grade. So it can be very useful to create an environment where students have room to experiment and room to grow and room to learn from their mistakes. We can do that with casual conversation in the home. One thing I encourage all of my students at all ages to do is to keep some sort of journal. Not necessarily in the sense of, dear diary, today I went to the park and I saw a bird, but just having something to write in and to get used to expressing ideas, to get used to exploring different ways of writing, different voices, different ways of communicating ideas, so that again, they're not only ever writing for school where it's limited to, oh, I have to do this for a grade. Encouraging a sense of play so that they can find their own voice is a great way to do it. So yeah, it really comes down to three things. One, encouraging conversation and changing ideas. Two, giving them a place to write and explore where they can go wrong, they can make mistakes, they can experiment and succeed. And then the more ideas they are exposed to, the more points of view they're exposed to, the more stories they hear, the more that they will absorb these kind of things passively and have a greater base to build up from and to draw from.
Thank you, Steve. Another commonly asked question from parents is that a lot of parents come to us to get help, and sometimes they don't find out whether they actually get to take the exam until maybe a few weeks before the exam. Or sometimes maybe 1 or 2 months before the exam. So if it's in such a short period, how could the students let's say improve their English, or maybe should they focus more on test taking skills, and how if it's only within a few weeks or 1 month? And I'm sure some of the parents who are attending today might actually have an upcoming entrance exam because most of them are offered in January and February. Then in that case, how could they cram it within a few weeks?
Well, this becomes then a question of economics. You have limited resources, you have limited time, limited student energy, and perhaps limited past papers. So what I would say there is focus on the places where those resources are going to build points. The verbal sections, as I've said, are very challenging to build up. Reading comprehension, the reading can be a challenge, but question types can really allow students to move more quickly and accurately through the test. So I would say at that point, it's probably a big case of building skills. Test taking skills can really help energize students and help them activate existing knowledge. If you're building fundamental knowledge, that's going to take a bit more time for students to get comfortable. If you're building the skills, that's going to allow them to repackage what they already have and use it more effectively. With the writing, I would focus on clean writing, so few mistakes, avoiding things like spelling mistakes, grammar mistakes, and then just having like a good idea and a good sense of personality.
I think that I think the last part, the good personality, really is a very important one. And thanks for pointing that out. I haven't heard of that suggestion very frequently. But I also wanted to, because I see that quite a few of the parents who are attending have maybe younger students. So as you said, and I think you pointed out very well, that telling them to memorize a list of vocab might not always be the most beneficial way. They might not be able to associate the vocab in other contexts besides just kind of memorization. But if they are younger students, how could they build up the vocab, and how do they know what type of vocab that will commonly appear in these exams? Because we often get a lot of parents asking us for vocab list. So what would your suggestion be along those lines?
I would say that when it comes to what kind of vocab to study, that's a very, very difficult question to answer because the tests are essentially pulling from the dictionary. Any reputable vocab list is probably going to be fine. Anything that you're getting from any of the major education companies, anything that is coming from an educational bureau or government office is probably going to be worthwhile. There's really no super bad list. I would maybe avoid anything that's too specifically themed, but really any sort of vocab list is probably going to be fine. As for how to build that vocab, I really think games are a great way to go. And incorporating the words into everyday use. Just drilling it isn't the most effective way to go because, as we said, that's building one pathway. But if students are doing things like, I know a lot of people play, as we said, like games, words with friends, that's a great way to build vocabulary because then there's a specific goal. Vocab quiz games, vocab building apps, there's loads of available ones. One thing that I've known students to do really well with is there's a lot of like tabletop games that challenge students and anyone really to come up with new words. Bananagrams is a good one. I'll write some of these in the chat, and I'm also seeing some questions coming to me privately. So bananagrams is a great one. Boggle is another good one. PDQ. These aren't necessarily going to help build new words, but they will get students trying to recall words, and it pushes their vocabulary. These are all essentially games about coming up with words on the spot, coming up with words and combing through your vocabulary for words that quickly and I've just immediately forgotten the word that I wanted to use. Words that follow particular rules and fit particular conditions. For example, my sister, we used to play Boggle in my house when I was young, and my sister expanded her vocabulary tremendously by simply guessing at combinations of letters and then forcing us to go to the dictionary to check what words worked. And so we all learned a great many words of my sister just making up words as she went. Scrabble is a useful one because, again, you're looking at a fixed letter, set combination of letters and thinking, well, this sounds like a word, or could this be a word? Let me check the dictionary. And obviously, people with more words available are going to experience more success with those kind of words.
That's very helpful, Mr. Steve. I think also I'm seeing a lot of the parents who are attending today. Some of their kids might be going to some local schools, or they might be going to some international schools, wanting to go to maybe UK boarding schools or US boarding schools. So if they're not taking the ISEE and SSAT, for example, if they're switching schools per se, what are tests that might be on UK boarding schools that usually not commonly covered in class that they definitely need to make sure that they cover more, like what type of reading comprehension? So for example, what I know of is that some of the schools in Hong Kong, even international schools, don't cover poetry all the time. But in these kind of entrance exams, sometimes poetry might come up. And so the students have totally no idea how to respond to any questions regarding poetry. So is there anything like anything that these students need to be exposed to more that might not be covered enough in school?
There's a number of them. Poetry, as you mentioned, comes up fairly regularly. There's also things like scientific diaries, that there have been some passages that come from like the diaries of Charles Darwin. Sometimes you will get occasionally things like political texts. Really, with something like, I mean, the SSAT usually doesn't pick material that's less than 100 years old because they can get it for free. And yeah, there are question types that ask things like, this might have come from a scientific journal, this might have come from a guidebook. The more text types you can expose your child to, the better off they will be. If there's anything that is coming up that might require someone to do a little bit of reading, bring your student in. Oh, we're thinking of taking a trip. Although obviously right now trips are maybe not the most available, but let's look at the brochure, let's look at the travel guide, let's look at the encyclopedia. There really is not a very tight limit on what kind of texts might get tested. Poetry, all types of nonfiction, biography, memoir, as I've said, diary, letters sometimes come up. Occasionally there will be from like popular magazines or, for lack of a better word, industry magazines like a scientific journal or like something like a Popular Mechanics or something like that. The more students are reading, the more they're exposed to the world, the better off they will be.
Thank you, Steve. So we have one more question from a parent. Faye is asking, if you have 6 to 12 months to prepare, how much time would you advise one spend on SSAT prep each week at a minimum? Self-study.
So it really does depend on the individual student. I would say 2 to 3 hours a week is not a bad place to start. One of the challenges is that there's a limited amount of material available. Not a bad rule of thumb is 1 test per week, if you can find that, if you have those tests available. Otherwise, yeah, sort of an hour per section, 45 minutes per section is not a bad way to go, because on test day, students aren't going to be spending more than an hour per section. So that's also going to help them get used to the timing. But again, a lot of it comes down to individual student abilities.
All right, so I just wanted to see if there are any other questions from parents. I mean, you can either type it or you can turn on your microphone and ask it. Perhaps we can have one or two more last questions. Before anyone speaks up, I would like to first thank Mr. Steve Leech. He is our standardized testing guru. And thank you very much for coming with a very comprehensive strategy list of how to ace these exams. If anyone in here that require or is interested in taking these exams or would like to actually do admissions, both UK and US, we can help out, and we would like to extend a free intro meeting for anyone who attended today's parent seminar. We can do a free diagnostic for your student who wants to either take these exams or want to do admissions. So do email us if you are interested. Also, as Mr. Steve just pointed out, our spring courses are available for signing up, and we just started. So if you do want to join, definitely go to our webpage. And we also will be offering SSAT and ISEE during Chinese New Year as well, if you are really worried about this. So yeah, I don't know if anyone else have any last minute questions.
I've received a few questions through private message.
Oh, okay. Well, public message. Faye wants to thank you personally for teaching her son Tyler over Christmas break.
Tyler was a pleasure to teach.
Faye.
I remember Tyler very well.
All right. Yeah. So Steve, yeah, maybe you shoot ahead.
Certainly. So we've got one question. How do UK schools decide if my child needs to take UK ISETs? The UK ISET is essentially a language proficiency exam. Individual schools are going to have different guidelines, but as a general approach, they're going to look at a city like Hong Kong, and it's going to depend on what curricular background the student has. If the student has been taught in an international school or an English language program, then they are much less likely to have to take the UK ISET. If they're coming from a local school or a curriculum that's not been taught in English, then they will probably have to take that test. Some schools will probably just say, Hong Kong, we don't count Hong Kong as an English-speaking region. All students from Hong Kong have to take the UK ISET. So it's going to come down a lot to essentially bureaucracy or what individual schools are doing. And then,
Steve, maybe I can chime in a little bit about this one. For UK boarding schools, just to let you know, there will be quite a few tests that you may be required. ISEB is one, UKSET is one, Common Entrance Exams are one. So it all depends, as Mr. Steve is saying, where you're from, and also which schools you're aiming at and what programs you are trying to apply into. If you actually want to get into very selective schools, sometimes you need to take subject tests as well. Every single UK school will require a school-specific entrance exam that they design themselves. Those exams are, although each school have their own exams, they are very similar. So you can actually buy some bond books, and they are similar in format. It's just the difficulty of the text and the selection of the text. And if you do want to know about which schools require which test, we do have a UK admission counselor, Mr. Rory Riley. He is very experienced. He's been doing this for 20 years and he himself was a registrar admission officer, so he can advise. So if you have any questions about that, you can email us as well. Sorry for interrupting, Steve.
No, not at all. It's very useful information. And I believe this is the last question. What are the differences between the ISEB and the CAT 4? The ISEB is I can never remember all of the acronyms. It's I think it's the Independent Schools Examination Board. which is essentially a very similar test to the ISEE, SSAT, and some of the other tests we've discussed today. It's looking at students who are looking at sort of around year 6. And again, it's going to be looking at mathematics, English, which is going to be sort of reading, writing comprehension, verbal reasoning, and non-verbal reasoning. So it's very much a sort of an academic test. The CAT 4 is the cognitive abilities test. I don't know if there's a CAT 3. I've never had the only exposure I've ever had is to the CAT 4. And that's much more almost like a developmental test where it's looking at things like spatial awareness, spatial reasoning, and it's not necessarily looking at academic knowledge as much as things like critical thinking, logical thinking, reasoning, and that sort of thing. It's much more of I would say, almost a psychological or a developmental test. But depending on what individual schools are after, they may be using it for all different types of information. I know some groups, I don't know any particular schools, but I know some groups have used it for admissions into sort of advanced honors programs and things like that.
Steve, just wanted to ask, is CAT 4 a computer-based adaptive exam, or is it a written-based?
As far as I'm aware, it's written-based.
Okay, because I remember I think the GSIS, the part 1 of the GSIS entrance exam is CAT 4. Mm-hmm. I think it was how they conducted it was maybe computer-based, but I think we can check up on that.
It's not a test.
Yeah, I think the CAT 4 probably there is written and computer-based probably.
Yeah, because I know some of it is about like tracing out shapes in a
exactly
and that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's less about verbal reasoning and more about non-verbal reasoning and logical thinking to see. Well, it's kind of like an IQ test a little bit to see where. Yeah, it's basically to see where your IQ is at, and after that, for example, if people want to get to GSIS, then usually that's the first stage they actually ask you to do, and then after they assess, okay, this student is up to a certain level of logical thinking, then they will let you then do the more academic ones, which is the English and the math parts. Yep, that's my understanding. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I hope this has been a very beneficial talk. If anyone has any feedback for the talk, feel free to email us as well, or if you have any questions. Thank you, Mr. Steve Leech, and hope everyone has a nice weekend and stay warm.